I should have known better than to camp alone, deep in the woods, where the shadows seem to whisper and the trees loom like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Yet, the tranquility of nature, the allure of solitude, had tempted me to set up my tent far from the comforts of civilization, in a clearing that felt oddly serene as dusk began to creep in, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink before darkness swallowed it whole. The forest had seemed inviting and peaceful, a place to escape the relentless hum of city life and reconnect with the simplicity of nature. I had stoked the fire, its crackling warmth a brief respite from the encroaching cold, and settled into my sleeping bag with a book, determined to enjoy the peace that had drawn me here. But as night fell and the forest came alive with sounds that were at once familiar and disconcerting, the hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, the noises seemed to take on a different quality, an unsettling rhythm that suggested something more sinister lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. I tried to ignore the mounting sense of unease that clung to the edges of my consciousness, focusing instead on the comforting glow of the fire and the pages of my book. The comforting warmth of the flames seemed to ward off the chill, but the growing darkness pressed in around me, turning the once friendly forest into a labyrinth of shifting shadows. The light from the fire flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. My mind, once occupied by the rhythmic patterns of the flames, began to conjure unsettling shapes and figures in the periphery of my vision. Despite my best efforts to convince myself it was just the play of light and my imagination, an unease settled in my chest, a growing anxiety I couldn't quite shake. The fire seemed to burn with a waning intensity, and the sense of being watched grew stronger with every passing minute, as though unseen eyes were fixed on me from the darkened woods. Then came the scratching, a soft, persistent sound that seemed to come from just outside the circle of light. My heart raced as I strained to see what might be causing it, but all I could see were the dark silhouettes of trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and I grabbed a flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness. The narrow pool of light revealed nothing but the empty forest, the scratching suddenly stopping as if it had never been there. I forced myself to laugh it off, attributing it to a curious animal or a trick of the wind, but sleep eluded me, my mind racing with irrational fears and wild imaginings. Hours later, as the fire dwindled to embers and the cold began to seep into my bones, I heard it again, a low, guttural growl this time, coming from somewhere close by, too close. My blood ran cold as I realized the sound was not that of any known creature. I lay perfectly still, my breath shallow, my ears straining to catch any further noise. The growl was unlike anything I had ever heard, primal and visceral, and though it never came again, the oppressive silence that followed was even more terrifying. The silence seemed to press in on me from all sides, a suffocating void that amplified my growing sense of dread. When morning finally came and the first light of dawn broke through the canopy, I packed up my gear with trembling hands, eager to leave the forest behind and return to the safety of the world I knew. The once beautiful clearing now seemed menacing, and every rustle of the underbrush set my nerves on edge. As I left the clearing, the forest appeared to close in behind me, the trees standing as silent witnesses to my hasty retreat. Yet, even as I made my way back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone, that something had been watching me all along, something that had followed me from the darkness of the night. As I looked back one last time, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing among the trees. Its eyes reflected the faintest glimmer of the morning light, before it vanished back into the forest. The sight was fleeting, a haunting image that lingered in my mind long after I had left the woods behind. The experience left me with a chilling certainty that the woods had claimed more than just my peace of mind, that something unseen had marked me, and the memory of that night would follow me far beyond the forest's edge. I had always been drawn to the idea of escaping into the wilderness, seeking solace from the cacophony of modern life. When the opportunity arose for a solitary camping trip, I seized it eagerly, believing that a few days away from the city would provide the tranquility I craved. The destination was a remote area deep in the forest, a place I had never been before, chosen for its promise of isolation and natural beauty. The journey to the campsite was an adventure in itself, as the narrow dirt roads twisted and turned through the dense forest, each bend revealing a deeper sense of seclusion. The air grew cooler and the forest thicker as I drove, the sunlight gradually fading until it was swallowed by the encroaching canopy of leaves. Arriving at the clearing where I intended to camp, I was struck by its eerie beauty. The space was framed by towering pines, their branches forming a dense, almost impenetrable barrier that filtered the last rays of sunlight into a dim, greenish hue. I set up my tent with a sense of satisfaction, feeling that I had found the perfect spot for a peaceful retreat. The sound of the forest was a soothing backdrop as I arranged my gear and gathered kindling for the fire. Once the tent was pitched and the fire was crackling merrily, I felt a wave of contentment. The warmth of the fire contrasted sharply with the growing chill of the evening, and I settled into my camping chair with a book, eager to lose myself in its pages as night fell. As darkness enveloped the clearing, the forest seemed to come alive with a new set of sounds. The hoot of an owl was punctuated by the occasional rustling of leaves, and the distant call of a coyote added to the sense of wilderness surrounding me. The firelight danced and flickered, casting shifting shadows that created an illusion of movement just outside the perimeter of light. Despite my attempts to focus on my book, a growing sense of unease began to gnaw at me. It wasn't the noises themselves but rather the feeling that they were somehow wrong, out of place, as if the forest were trying to communicate something unsettling. When the scratching started, it was so subtle that I almost convinced myself it was a figment of my imagination. The sound was soft, rhythmic, like fingernails gently scraping against the bark of a tree, but it was unnervingly persistent. My heart began to race as I looked around, peering into the darkened woods, but I saw nothing except the shifting shadows and the dark silhouettes of trees. I grabbed my flashlight and swept its beam across the surrounding area, but the light revealed nothing more than the empty, shadowy forest. The scratching stopped abruptly as soon as I shone the flashlight toward the source of the noise, but the silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. I tried to brush it off, attributing it to some nocturnal animal, perhaps a raccoon or a squirrel. The fire crackled and popped, its warmth a small comfort against the growing chill of the night. I tried to read, but the sense of being watched only intensified, making it impossible to focus. Every rustle of leaves and every snap of a twig seemed magnified, filled with a foreboding that I couldn't quite explain. My attempts to rationalize the sounds failed miserably as my mind spiraled into darker thoughts. Was it possible that something more sinister was lurking just beyond the light of the fire? Hours passed with me lying awake, my thoughts racing. Just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it again, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the clearing. It was unlike any animal noise I had ever heard, deep and resonant, sending shivers down my spine. I lay perfectly still, barely daring to breathe, straining to hear any further sounds. The growl came from somewhere close, but when I shone my flashlight in the direction of the noise, the beam illuminated only empty forest. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, the oppressive quiet amplified by my own racing heartbeat. The night seemed interminable, each minute stretching into an eternity. My sense of dread grew with every passing hour, and the shadows cast by the firelight seemed to take on new, menacing shapes. As dawn finally began to break, the first light of morning did little to dispel the unease that had settled over me. I packed up my gear quickly, my hands trembling as I folded the tent and gathered my belongings. The forest, now bathed in the pale light of dawn, seemed to hold its breath as I prepared to leave. The once familiar clearing now felt alien, its beauty tainted by the night's events. As I drove away, the forest seemed to close in behind me, the trees standing as silent witnesses to the terror I had experienced. The sense of being watched never fully left me, and I could not shake the feeling that something had been following me, lurking just out of sight. The encounter left me with a haunting certainty that the forest held secrets that were best left undisturbed. The memory of that night clung to me long after I returned to the safety of the city, a chilling reminder that sometimes, the wilderness is not as welcoming as it first appears. The campfire's secret remained with me, an eerie reminder that the shadows of the forest can conceal more than just the dark. There's a sense of nostalgia and adventure that accompanies the decision to camp alone in the heart of the wilderness. That's what drove me to choose an isolated spot deep in the forest, far from the familiar comforts of home. The area was reputed for its stunning natural beauty, and after a long week of work, I was eager to experience the serenity of a remote campsite. The journey there was an adventure in itself, winding through dense woods and along gravel roads that seemed to disappear into the thick foliage. The forest enveloped me as I ventured deeper, the trees forming an archway that led to my destination. When I arrived at the clearing, I was greeted by an eerie, almost surreal stillness. The area was beautiful, surrounded by tall pines and a gentle stream that babbled softly in the distance. The ground was covered in a layer of soft, pine-needled carpet, and the air was crisp and refreshing. I set up my tent with a sense of satisfaction, feeling that I had found a little piece of paradise away from the bustling world. As dusk fell, I lit a campfire, its warm glow casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the clearing. The night sky was clear, and the stars twinkled brightly overhead, adding to the illusion of tranquility. I roasted marshmallows and enjoyed the simple pleasure of the fire's warmth, feeling content and at peace. As the fire burned low, I settled into my sleeping bag inside the tent, the gentle crackling of the embers outside a soothing lullaby. I read for a while, the glow of my flashlight casting a small circle of light around me, before I finally turned off the light and tried to drift off to sleep. But sleep did not come easily. The forest around me, once so inviting, now seemed to be hiding something in its depths. The sounds of the night were no longer comforting, they had taken on a sinister edge. The occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves now seemed more deliberate, as if they were trying to convey a message I couldn't quite decipher. My eyes flitted open as I heard a strange, intermittent sound, a low, rhythmic thudding that seemed to come from just outside the perimeter of my campsite. Curiosity mixed with a growing sense of dread as I poked my head out of the tent. The moonlight illuminated the clearing with a ghostly sheen, casting elongated shadows that swayed eerily. I saw nothing unusual, just the same trees and underbrush that had been there before. The thudding sound stopped abruptly, leaving me with an unsettling silence that was even more unnerving. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than the natural sounds of the forest, but the anxiety refused to dissipate. As the hours passed, the thudding returned, this time louder and more insistent. It was accompanied by a faint, disembodied whispering that seemed to ebb and flow with the breeze. I strained to hear the whispers but couldn't make out any coherent words. I grabbed my flashlight once more and unzipped the tent, shining the beam in all directions, but the forest remained as still and unresponsive as ever. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I decided to venture outside, despite my fear, driven by a need to confront whatever was causing the disturbance. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees forming a tight, suffocating barrier. The whispering stopped abruptly as I moved, replaced by an oppressive silence that was punctuated only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. My flashlight flickered and dimmed, casting eerie, shifting shadows that danced just beyond my line of sight. As I reached the edge of the clearing, the flashlight illuminated a peculiar sight: footprints. They were large, uneven, and seemed to lead away from the campfire toward the forest. My heart raced as I followed the tracks, which seemed to disappear into the thick underbrush. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. The tracks led to a small, abandoned campsite, overgrown with weeds and hidden among the trees. The remnants of an old fire pit and scattered belongings, long neglected, gave the place an unsettling, forlorn quality. A cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faint, mournful wail of the whispering I had heard earlier. The sound seemed to come from all directions, growing louder and more insistent. I backed away from the abandoned campsite, the feeling of being watched overwhelming. My flashlight flickered again and then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to return to my own campsite, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I reached my tent, I felt a rush of relief, but the sense of dread remained. I spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened alertness, the whispering and thudding continuing intermittently outside. As dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear with a sense of urgency, eager to leave the unsettling forest behind. The once beautiful clearing now felt like a place tainted by an unseen presence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me all along. As I drove away from the forest, the memory of that night lingered like a dark cloud. The phantom campsite and the mysterious whispers remained a haunting enigma, a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. The forest had revealed a secret that night, one that would stay with me long after I left its shadowed depths. The campfire's secret was one of eerie silence and unseen eyes, a chilling reminder that the wilderness can hold more than just natural wonders, it can also harbor the echoes of things better left unexplored. It was a decision I made on a whim, an impromptu solo camping trip to clear my mind and find some solitude. The forest I chose was reputed to be picturesque, a hidden gem among the many nature spots that dot the region. It was supposed to be a simple escape from the routine, a chance to disconnect and recharge. The drive there was long, but the scenery was breathtaking, with towering trees and winding paths that led deeper into the untouched wilderness. By the time I arrived at the clearing I had chosen, the sun was beginning its descent, casting an orange glow that filtered through the canopy in a mesmerizing display of light and shadow. Setting up camp was a calming ritual. I pitched my tent in the center of the clearing, meticulously arranging my gear and gathering kindling for a fire. The quiet of the forest was a soothing backdrop to the mundane tasks of camping, unpacking, setting up the tent, and starting the fire. The flames crackled and popped, sending occasional bursts of light into the surrounding darkness. I prepared a simple meal and sat by the fire, savoring the solitude and the warmth as the cool evening air began to settle in. As night fell, the forest transformed. The comforting sounds of the day gave way to an unfamiliar symphony of nocturnal noises. The rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, and the distant hoots of owls became the new soundtrack to my evening. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows that danced on the edge of the clearing, creating an illusion of movement that played tricks on my eyes. Despite my attempts to focus on a book, I felt a growing unease that I couldn't quite explain. It was as if the darkness was pressing in, wrapping around me in an almost tangible way. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic thudding that I initially attributed to some animal moving through the underbrush. The sound was distant but persistent, like a heartbeat echoing through the forest. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to the typical noises of wildlife, but the thudding grew louder and more irregular, its rhythm unsettling and disconcerting. The firelight flickered, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently, my senses on high alert. I decided to investigate, driven by a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped cautiously out of the circle of light provided by the fire, shining the beam into the darkness. The forest loomed around me, an oppressive wall of shadow and sound. I followed the direction of the thudding, which seemed to come from deeper within the woods. The flashlight's beam revealed nothing unusual, just the dense underbrush and the towering trees that loomed like silent sentinels. As I ventured further, the thudding grew louder, its rhythm more erratic. It was accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible whispering that seemed to ebb and flow with the breeze. The whispering was too soft to make out, but it felt as if it were coming from all directions, wrapping around me in a disorienting embrace. I moved cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing more than the same unchanging forest. My nerves were on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Suddenly, the thudding stopped. The abrupt silence that followed was deafening, the whispering fading into an unsettling quiet. I turned to make my way back to the campsite, but the forest seemed different now, as if the shadows had shifted and the trees had rearranged themselves. The familiar landmarks I had noted on my way out seemed distorted and unrecognizable. My heart pounded as I retraced my steps, trying to find my way back to the clearing. Just as I was beginning to panic, the thudding resumed, now closer and more insistent. It was as if it were right behind me, a relentless, rhythmic pounding that echoed in my ears. I stumbled through the darkness, my flashlight flickering and dimming, casting erratic beams of light that only seemed to deepen the shadows. My breathing was ragged, and fear surged through me with every step. I finally burst into the clearing, my relief palpable as I saw the familiar sight of my tent and the dying embers of the fire. But the sense of safety was short-lived. The thudding had stopped again, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I quickly relit the fire, its warm glow a comforting barrier against the encroaching darkness. I sat by the fire, my mind racing, trying to calm my racing heart. The night stretched on, the silence only interrupted by the occasional snap of the fire and the distant, haunting sounds of the forest. I huddled in my sleeping bag, the fear of what might be lurking in the darkness keeping me wide awake. Sleep was elusive, and the sense of being watched never fully left me. I listened intently to every sound, every whisper, every rustle of leaves. When dawn finally arrived, I packed up my camp with a sense of urgency, eager to leave the unsettling forest behind. The clearing, once a tranquil haven, now felt like a place of ominous secrets and hidden dangers. As I drove away, the forest receded into the distance, but the memory of the night lingered. The thudding, the whispering, and the sense of being watched were haunting reminders that some places hold more than just natural beauty, they can also harbor the echoes of something dark and unseen.